Could you actually just shoot Voldemort in the head and be done with it? There's a question that's haunted Harry Potter fans for decades, and it goes something like this. Forget the Elder Wand and an entire 7-book, 8-movie war against Voldemort. Could a single Muggle with a 9mm handgun have solved the entire Wizarding world's problems in about half a second? The answer is way more complicated and way more fascinating than you'd expect. And by the end of this, you might come away thinking that Lord Voldemort, the most feared dark wizard in history, had a fatal blind spot that had nothing to do with love, prophecies, or wand allegiance. It had to do with his complete and utter ignorance of the non-magical world. But before we get there, we need to understand exactly what's keeping Voldemort alive in the first place, because the man didn't just have a backup plan. He tried to build 6 of them, and accidentally ended up with 7 anchors to life. Let's talk about the Horcruxes. At its core, a Horcrux is a piece of wizard's soul that's been ripped away and hidden inside a physical object. And I do mean ripped. You don't gently separate your soul like pulling apart cotton candy. You have to commit murder. The act has to be so heinous, so fundamentally evil that it literally fractures your soul at its deepest level. Then, through an incredibly dark ritual that even most dark wizards consider off-limits, a ritual that young Tom Riddle first learned about by manipulating Professor Horace Slughorn into revealing the forbidden details. You take that broken fragment and seal it away inside something. Now here's the key mechanism, the reason this whole system works. In the wizarding world, a partial soul cannot pass on to the afterlife. Think about that. If your soul is whole and your body dies, your soul moves on. That's the natural order. But if you've torn your soul apart and stashed a piece of it somewhere else, the fragment still living inside your body has nowhere to go when that body is destroyed. It stays trapped in the living world whether it wants to or not. This is exactly what happened to Voldemort on Halloween night, 1981, when his killing curse Avada Kedavra rebounded off baby Harry Potter, thanks to Lily Potter's sacrificial protection. His body was completely obliterated, gone. But because he'd already created 6 Horcruxes at that point, the piece of his soul still living inside him couldn't move on. It was stuck. He existed as, in his own words, less than the meanest ghost, a shell, a vapor clinging to existence out of sheer stubbornness. And he stayed that way for 14 years. 14 years of drifting through the forests of Albania, occasionally possessing animals, mainly snakes, though he hated doing it because animal bodies couldn't perform magic properly, and his possession would burn through their lifespans in days. 14 years of being the most powerful dark wizard in history with absolutely no power at all. Let that sink in. Voldemort already knew what it was like to lose his body. He'd already lived through the worst-case scenario of physical destruction. And he preferred it to dying, because as Rowling herself put it, the thing that Voldemort fears more than anything else is his own death. It is the quest of his life to cheat death. So, Voldemort didn't just make 1 Horcrux as a safety net. He went further than any wizard in recorded history. He made 7. His soul was carved into 8 total pieces, 7 tucked away in Horcruxes, and 1 final sliver still rattling around inside his body. He proudly announced to his Death Eaters on the night he regained physical form in 1995, "I who have gone further than anybody along the path that leads to immortality." And look, the man wasn't wrong. On paper, this is an absurdly effective immortality system. Let me walk you through what he used. In 1943, when Tom Riddle was just 16 years old, he created the Diary, his first Horcrux. He used the murder of Moaning Myrtle to fracture his soul for the very first time. Around the same time, he created a second Horcrux for Marvolo Gaunt's ring, using the murder of his own father and grandparents. Then came Slytherin's locket, the very same locket that Regulus Black would later die trying to steal and destroy. Then Hufflepuff's cup, then Ravenclaw's diadem, each one hidden in a different location, each one protected by different magical defenses. Then came the accident, on that Halloween night in Godric's Hollow when his curse rebounded. His soul was so unstable from having been split 6 times already that a fragment broke off on its own and latched onto the only living thing left in the room, baby Harry Potter. Voldemort had no idea. He just created a Horcrux he never planned and never knew about. And finally, in 1994, he created his 7th and final intentional Horcrux by placing a soul fragment inside his snake Nagini, using the murder of Bertha Jorkins. 7 Horcruxes, 7 anchors. 7 reasons why simply destroying his body wouldn't be enough. So, now, let's get to the real question. You pull out a gun. You aim it at Voldemort's big ugly white head. You pull the trigger. What happens? If even a single Horcrux still exists, the bullet kills the body. Full stop. A bullet to the brain destroys his physical form just as effectively as a rebounding Avada Kedavra did. Wizards are human. They're flesh and blood and bone. They can harness magic, but strip that away and they're just as squishy and mortal as the rest of us. A bullet doesn't care about your magical ability, but it doesn't matter. Destroy his body and you're right back to 1981. Voldemort becomes a wraith again, a disembodied spirit, miserable, powerless, drifting, but alive, still tethered. Still anchored by those soul fragments scattered across Britain. And given enough time and the right followers, he'd find a way back. He did it before. He'd do it again. A headshot with Horcruxes intact is a setback. A massive, painful, humiliating setback that cost him years, maybe decades. But it's not death. Not even close. Now, flip the script. What if all 7 Horcruxes have already been destroyed? As Dumbledore told Harry directly, and this is a direct quote from the books. Without his Horcruxes, Voldemort will be a mortal man, with a maimed and diminished soul. A mortal man, that's Dumbledore's exact phrasing. Once those anchors are gone, Voldemort is as killable as anyone else walking the streets of London. And yes, that includes being killed by a bullet. Now this is what makes the destruction timeline so important. Harry destroyed the diary in 1993 with a basilisk fang in the Chamber of Secrets. Dumbledore took out the ring in the summer of 1996 using the Sword of Gryffindor, which had been impregnated with basilisk venom. Ron destroyed the locket in late 1997. Also with the Sword of Gryffindor, and then on May 2nd, 1998, in the span of a single day during the Battle of Hogwarts, the remaining 4 were eliminated. Hermione destroyed the cup with basilisk fangs. Vincent Crabbe accidentally destroyed the diadem by casting Fiendfire in the Room of Requirement. Harry walked into the Forbidden Forest and let Voldemort hit him with the killing curse, Avada Kedavra, destroying the soul fragment inside him while surviving thanks to the complex magic of sacrifice and the Elder Wand's allegiance. And finally, Neville Longbottom, absolute legend, decapitated Nagini with the Sword of Gryffindor. After Neville's swing, for the first time since 1943, Lord Voldemort had 0 backup lives. He was mortal, and minutes later, his own killing curse rebounded one final time and finished him for good. But here's where things get really interesting, and where the gun question becomes less about raw physics and more about practical reality. Because even if Voldemort is theoretically killable by a bullet, could you actually land the shot? Voldemort wasn't just standing around waiting to get hit. The man could apparate, instantaneous teleportation with no incantation required, just intent and will. He could fly without a broom, something no other wizard in history had achieved. He could cast Protego and more powerful shield charms, which are explicitly stated to block both spells and physical forces. He had near-flawless control, speed, and efficiency in spellcasting. He could duel multiple opponents simultaneously while performing complex magic under extreme pressure. And he'd mastered both nonverbal and wandless casting, meaning he didn't even need to speak or gesture to defend himself. So, you'd need to catch him completely off guard. No warning, no time to react. No time to apparate or throw up a Protego. And here's the delicious irony, because this actually is where the whole thing becomes genuinely plausible. Wizards don't know what guns are. That's not an exaggeration. In the Harry Potter universe, the Daily Prophet, the Wizarding World's primary newspaper, describes a gun as a kind of metal wand that Muggles use to kill each other. That's it. That's their full understanding. A metal wand. They have no concept of how a firearm works, how fast a bullet travels, or what it would do to a human body. The contrast couldn't be sharper when you think about someone like Arthur Weasley, who spent his entire career at the Ministry of Magic obsessively collecting Muggle artifacts, and still couldn't explain what a rubber duck was for. And he was one of the most Muggle-curious wizards alive. Voldemort, raised in a Muggle orphanage, might have had slightly more awareness than the average wizard, but his entire identity was built on rejecting the Muggle world. He despised it. He refused to engage with it. He considered it beneath him. His obsession with pureblood supremacy and his contempt for anything Muggle-born made it ideologically impossible for him to take the non-magical world seriously as a threat. And that arrogance is a vulnerability. There's a fan debate that's been raging for years about whether shield charms like Protego could actually stop bullets. Some fans argue that since Protego and its stronger variants can protect against a 1,000-foot fall and withstand waterfalls powerful enough to overturn mining carts, they should handle a bullet easily. Others point out that you still need to cast the charm before the bullet arrives. And a bullet from a modern firearm, your standard 9mm Parabellum, travels at around 370 meters per second, while a 45 ACP moves at roughly 250, and some supersonic rifle rounds push past 900 meters per second, well past the speed of sound, which sits at about 343 meters per second. Many rounds are supersonic, which means you'd hear the gunshot after the bullet had already hit you. Could Voldemort cast a Protego fast enough that a bullet can cross a room? Maybe. Wizards seem to have supernatural reaction times in combat. But would he even recognize the threat? Would he know to cast a shield when some Muggle points a small metal tube at him? Or would he sneer and wait for the inevitable, not realizing that the inevitable was a piece of lead moving faster than anything in his magical experience? Think about what wizarding combat actually looks like in practice. In the Battle of Hogwarts, McGonagall, Slughorn, and Kingsley dueled Voldemort simultaneously, and even their combined shield work couldn't hold him off forever. But every defensive spell in that battle was cast in response to something visible. A flash of colored light, a raised wand, a spoken incantation. Wizards fight reactively. They see a curse coming, they block it. A bullet doesn't announce itself with colored light or a raised wand. There's a small mechanical click, and then a piece of metal arrives before the brain has finished processing the sound of the shot. Wizarding duels operate at the speed of human reaction. Firearms operate at the speed of physics. Nothing in a century of magical combat would have prepared any wizard for the gap between those two speeds. So, who could have actually pulled this off? The most obvious candidates would be Muggle-born wizards, people who grew up in the non-magical world, understood exactly what a firearm could do, and had enough knowledge of wizarding society to know when Voldemort would be exposed. Someone like Dean Thomas, who grew up watching action movies and could probably identify a Glock at 20 paces. Or Hermione Granger, who understood both worlds better than almost anyone alive. The best window would have been the Battle of Hogwarts, specifically the final minutes after Neville killed Nagini. Every Horcrux was gone, Voldemort was mortal, fighting in an open courtyard completely focused on magical combat, surrounded by chaos. A Muggle-born wizard with a concealed handgun positioned in one of the castle's upper balconies could have ended the entire war with a single well-placed shot from a distance Voldemort wouldn't even have registered as dangerous. He would have been scanning for wands, completely blind to the idea that the real threat was a piece of metal moving faster than sound, from 200 meters away. The weapon most likely to kill the most dangerous wizard in history was available at any sporting goods store in Greater London. And this brings us to perhaps the greatest irony in the entire series, one that Rowling seems to have embedded intentionally into the story's DNA. Voldemort used magic to try to kill a baby, a 1-year-old child, something that could have been accomplished through entirely non-magical means. If he'd simply walked into Godric's Hollow and killed Harry physically with his bare hands, a knife, literally anything that wasn't Avada Kedavra, Harry would be dead. The curse would never have rebounded. Voldemort's body would never have been destroyed. The entire series wouldn't have happened. And guns aren't even the most efficient option. Poison, for instance. Wizards use poisons constantly. They understand basilisk venom and wolfsbane and veritas serum. But they have almost zero awareness of Muggle chemistry. A few drops of something odorless in a drink and Voldemort's magical defenses become completely irrelevant. Because you can't cast Protego against something already inside your bloodstream. Explosives are another blind spot the wizarding world has never seriously encountered. Wizards have Reducto and Confringo and Bombarda, but they've never seen what a shaped charge does to a building. The Muggle world spent the entire 20th century perfecting the science of large-scale destruction. Landmines, artillery, guided missiles, and the wizarding world missed all of it. They were still dueling one-on-one with sticks while Muggles were splitting atoms. The gap between magical and non-magical destructive capability isn't as wide as wizards assume, and in certain specific scenarios it runs in the opposite direction entirely. And it's worth remembering that there was even a prophecy delivered by Sybil Trelawney that said neither could live while the other survived. Voldemort heard it and chose to fulfill it by going after Harry directly, with magic, when perhaps the simplest solution was the one he was too arrogant to consider. He built Horcruxes to avoid death and ended up dying several decades before the average wizard's natural lifespan. He died at 71. For a wizard, that's practically middle-aged. Dumbledore lived to 115 and only died because he chose to. Voldemort's obsession with magical immortality didn't extend his life, it shortened it. And here's the final darkest piece of the puzzle. What happened to Voldemort's soul after all the Horcruxes were gone and his body was finally permanently destroyed? In the books, and this is a detail the movies completely changed, Voldemort's body doesn't disintegrate into ash and float away on the wind. His corpse just falls. It hits the floor of the Great Hall like any other dead body. They move it to a separate room away from the celebration, because despite everything, despite the Horcruxes and the dark rituals and the decades of terror, Voldemort was still a mortal man who left behind a mortal corpse. That was Rowling's point. That was the theme. All of his efforts to transcend death, and he ended up as a body on a floor. But his soul, his mangled, mutilated, 8 times fractured soul, we actually see what becomes of it. When Harry is hit by Avada Kedavra in the Forbidden Forest and visits that strange limbo version of King's Cross Station, he sees something under one of the benches, a small, flayed, trembling thing shaped like a baby, raw and beyond help. That was the fragment of Voldemort's soul, and Dumbledore tells Harry there's nothing that can be done for it. Voldemort's broken soul is trapped in limbo for eternity, unable to move on to the afterlife, unable to return as a ghost, unable to do anything except exist in that mangled, suffering form forever. The man who feared death more than anything in existence found something worse than death. Compare that to how Dumbledore handled the same question. Dumbledore was arguably just as brilliant as Voldemort, certainly more powerful, and he had every reason to fear death. He carried decades of guilt over his sister Ariana's death, guilt that haunted him until his final breath. But instead of running, Dumbledore called death the next great adventure. He planned his own end. He orchestrated it down to the last detail with Snape, walked into it with purpose, and when Harry met him in that same King's Cross limbo, Dumbledore was whole, calm, and at peace. 2 extraordinary wizards, both facing the same inevitable end. The one who accepted it passed through to the other side. The one who fought it with everything he had ended up as a trembling thing under a bench, alone forever. So, can Voldemort survive a headshot with Horcruxes intact? Yes. His body dies, but he comes back. Without them, absolutely not. He's as mortal as you or me. But the real answer, the one that makes this question so much richer than a simple yes or no, is that Voldemort's entire life was built around asking the wrong questions. He spent 55 years asking, how do I avoid death? When the better question might have been, what am I so afraid of? He split his soul 7 times, murdered countless people, terrorized an entire civilization, and in the end, he died anyway, decades younger than he should have, with a soul so damaged it couldn't find peace in the afterlife. A gun or a knife could have stopped Voldemort, but what actually stopped Voldemort was Voldemort. His arrogance and his inability to understand that there are things worse than death, and that by running from it so desperately, he was sprinting directly toward the worst fate imaginable. The most powerful dark wizard who ever lived, brought down by the one thing he never bothered to understand, being human. So yeah, turns out Voldemort's biggest weakness was ignoring the Muggle world entirely, which raises a fair question. Why didn't wizards ever just conquer it? That's your next lesson here at Stickman Hogwarts. Click now before someone tells Voldemort's ghost what a drone is.